right now. But thank you for, oh, my thing just slid. But thank you for taking the time to listen to my project because this project was really important to me. I actually spoke to Miss Ivanchikova earlier today about what this project meant to me and like what it meant for other students of color on this campus. Um, so what inspired me to write about this is because like me being a senior and being here when the first election occurred and other people reacted to it or whatnot, and the elections are coming back again, I seen the tensions amongst the student body. I've seen the tensions amongst students and faculty in terms of in terms of just systemic oppression itself. Like people tend to I'm very nervous. People tend to be very stubborn when it comes to their views, and they tend to push their views onto other people no matter whether or not it may hurt that other person or not. So what I wanted to do with this project is to like bring all of that to the open and basically ask the whole student body and faculty, what are we going to do about it for the future generation of students that might come here. So what I wanted to do was to read a section of my project. And the section I will be reading from is the part where it says, "The president doesn't care, so why should we?" I timed myself when reading this. It's about 3 minutes, so don't worry, you guys, it's not that long. So I'll start. Donald Trump has shown no sense of restraint or remorse in the things he said in response to the coronavirus. He believed that China had lied about the coronavirus by keeping the virus a secret until other people, besides Chinese people, were infected. While Trump seems to be bashing these people and calling them liars, he isn't bashing the Americans that traveled to Wuhan and other parts of China after the United States and the rest of the world heard about the virus. At the end of 2019, China had reported the amount of people currently infected with the coronavirus and explained all of the symptoms they've known so far about it. And in January of 2020, China had been working with the World Health Organization to spread information about the illness and to come up for a game plan for if other places were infected. Despite the United States knowing of the respiratory disease and about how hard of a time China was having with containing the virus, on January 15, 2020, the United States allowed for a man to return from his trip to Wuhan and became the first confirmed case of the coronavirus within the United States in Washington state. To make matters worse, the United States hosted a rescue mission to save 400 or so Americans from the Diamond Princess cruise ship in February 2020, after the ship was in a 14-day quarantine in Japan, even though 44 of them were diagnosed with the coronavirus, and that's after the World Health Organization issued a global health emergency. Donald Trump and some of his associates in the Republican office had blatantly referred to the coronavirus as the Kung flu and the Chinese virus. Trump claimed that him saying Chinese virus was only to state the place of origin of the virus. But of course, saying Chinese virus or Kung flu is going to cause some tension with Asians and non-Asians within the United States. The coronavirus isn't the only pandemic the world has faced. The bubonic plague took the lives of millions in the mid-1300s. There was the influenza virus that came around 1918, which infected at least a third of the world's population since there was a war going on. Afterwards, different strands of the influenza virus kept appearing in the United States within the 20th century. Fast forward into 2008, parents in the United States were scared to send their kids to public schools due to the swine flu influenza sweeping around again. Despite these respiratory illnesses being around the United States since the early 1900s, Donald Trump chooses to isolate China and make China into the fall guy for the coronavirus popping up and thousands of US citizens being affected. The sad thing about Donald Trump referring to the coronavirus as Kung flu is that he said so after his spat with the Chinese American reporter Wei Jiazhong. After Trump has tweeted, "Asian Americans are very angry at what China has done to our country and the world. Chinese Americans are the most angry of all, and I don't blame them." Zhang asked Trump a simple question, which was why he kept stating that the United States is performing better than other countries in terms of testing for the coronavirus. Zhang felt as though Trump was making the coronavirus a global competition and wanted to see what was inside of the president to do so. However, Zhang's genuine question was met with disrespect, disregard, and blatant xenophobia. Maybe that's a question you should ask China. Don't ask me, ask China that question, okay? Is what Trump had to say to Zhang when Trump was called out for his racism. He left the briefing immediately, feeling no compunction whatsoever to how he treated Wei Zhang that day. And that's just some of my section of the president doesn't care, so why should we? The reason why I wanted to read that section, again, like I said, I was here during the first time that Donald Trump was elected. And honestly, it wasn't pretty. We already knew about what Donald Trump was saying about Mexicans and building the border and like this whole idea of like American, we're Americans, we're proud Americans, we're proud of our country. And honestly, after the elections that year, it was just really sad. It was really scary because I actually had a couple of friends, Hispanic friends, who actually told me about how they were harassed by a couple of students, frat students, telling them to go back to their country. It's late at night. Obviously, no family is around. We're coming from like New York City, or we're coming from Los Angeles or other places in the country, far away from our homes. And like I said, there's different ideologies. There's different ways of dealing with our ideologies. And I know for a fact that 2016 was scary for some students here. Like, it just seemed like there was just all this tension, but that tension was to be expected. It's normalized, you know, people having differentiating opinions, that's supposed to happen. But what happens when one of the people that has the differentiating opinion tends to have a place of more power than the other students on campus? Like, it just seems like no matter what, unless a person is white or of, I don't know, some sort of ambiguity that makes them look white, they're more safe than a Black or Hispanic or Asian student on this campus. And also, with me talking about Trump way of mentioning the coronavirus, him saying Kung flu. Like I said, students were already influenced by him and started harassing some of the Hispanic and Latino students on this campus. So with other stuff going on within Hobart William Smith colleges, like, I just feel like with the elections coming up right now, I want to like have a conversation about this, see what can we do to make students, especially the Asian students, feel safer on this campus. Yeah, there's not that much in-person instruction, but there's still people around us. There's still people that are right next door to each other, and these walls are thin. We hear everything, and honestly, for a lot of us, it's just not a safe environment. So what I wanted to do was see, well, what can I do to bring some change, you know? So when I heard about this internship, and I was really glad I got it, I was like, you know what? I'm gonna write about this because I was there when that student got egged in the shower and told to go back to his country. And I was there when people were trying to make this whole list of demands, but then never going through with it, people feeling betrayed and whatnot. I was there through all of that. However, it just seems like a lot of the things that go on within this campus are behind closed doors where not a lot of people knows what's actually going on. So if anything, I wanted this, like, at least my presentation to be a chance for some people to like share some of the things that may have happened to them. And believe me, like, it's not just Asian students I was talking about here too, because like I said, this project was really something personal to me, given like the Black Lives Matter protests happening around throughout the entire country for like since, like, I'll say around June, because nobody really knew about Daniel Pruitt, nor did anybody know about George Floyd around that time, or Breonna Taylor. So yeah, that's basically the first part of my presentation. Y'all gotta excuse me, my brain is like all over the place right now. I am so nervous, and I want to make sure I make a lot of sense with this. But I said earlier that I spoke to Miss Ivanchikova earlier today, and I found out that the president decided to release a bill where he is banning diversity talks, diversity works, where people are supposed to basically work on basically, I'll just say work on their privilege. Like whenever people are addressing somebody's privilege, that's supposed to be a problem, because he believes that by mentioning that some people have more privilege than others, we're actually dividing the country more, even though every single time we tend to talk about even though we tend to talk about people's privileges and whatnot, like the conversation isn't really fully completed because we're still having this conversation to this day, like we still haven't really fully tackled on the diversity problem within this country, and hearing that he was eager to pass this bill and the way the website was describing it as if he's actually doing a good thing for this country. To me, it just felt like he was disregarding all of us. He was disregarding the Black people, the Asian people, the Hispanic people that have been protesting this entire summer and still continuing to protest, especially in Rochester. He's disregarding them. He's disregarding the fact that they feel like they are so invisible and they are so disposable to these people. The coronavirus has been a very scary time, not just for me, for all of us. Like a lot of us, we probably don't remember 2008 when the swine flu occurred because a lot of us was younger around the time, but I'm pretty sure people older than us probably knew about that time. It was probably scary for them. But right now, us growing as adults, growing into this new election, this is really scary. I actually had a couple of family members diagnosed with COVID-19. I actually lost a couple of family members to COVID-19. And recently, I was scared with the fact that the people closest to me, my mother, my little brother could have possibly had COVID-19. And I'm 8 hours away. And, what are we going to do? Are we going to actually just wait for this to just pass by and just keep continuing things as if nothing's happening? Or are we going to actually look at what's been going on during the coronavirus, all of the things that's been brought to our attention during the coronavirus, such as police brutality, such as blatant xenophobia, systemic oppression? Are we actually going to talk about it? I feel like, in a way, the coronavirus was a chance for us to actually fully have a discussion about systemic oppression. While we lost some lives over the time period of this virus, I feel like a lot of things was brought into our attention. We're going back and we're still reviewing some of the cases that happened beforehand when it came to police brutality. We're still talking about Trayvon Martin. We're still talking about Mike Brown. We're still talking about these things that seem to keep happening. And I don't know if you guys watch the news, but there's still cases of police brutality. It's now more people are actually starting to report this. One thing I talked about in my project was the fact that all 50 states was protesting for Black Lives Matter. To me, that was a big improvement but considering this whole country's history when it came to fighting for civil rights, seeing all 50 states kind of stand up together and be no, this is not okay. That showed me some hope. And that showed me you know what, instead of feeling as if there's just going to be this cycle of systemic oppression, maybe there's just a way that we can actually break through this, because to see all states fighting for this it's just I don't know, it just made me believe that Hobart William Smith can do something about that too. So yeah. I think I'm done. Anybody have any questions? I might talk after some questions because my
Mm, sounds good, and just about on time. I think, we can take a couple of comments here, especially if people have something to add. And I see Leah, Professor Schaffer. You can unmute yourself now. Mm-hmm.
Thanks. Skye, thank you so much for talking with us and sharing some of your research and some of your thoughts. I thought that was really interesting and powerful. So I really appreciate you taking the time to do that work and to come here and talk with us about it. I guess my question isn't about something you directly addressed, but it's something I'm wondering about your thoughts on, which is the NBA and the WNBA teams having Black Lives Matter on their courts and wearing the t-shirts that say like Breonna Taylor's name. I mean, what are your thoughts about that kind of visibility and whether or not it's having an effect or the kind of effect that you would like to see?
Honestly, I appreciate it. I appreciate that type of solidarity within like the NBA and like WNBA. However, like I said, like we continue to live in this cycle of systemic oppression. I actually seen like I think it was like the performance show for like I don't watch sports, but like for like football or whatnot, and it was the I don't know if you know Chloe X Holly or whatever, I forgot her name, but they had on a shirt where they were specifically addressing like police brutality on Black individuals. And I don't know, like if you guys look at that video, I want to see if you actually like can like catch onto it. But anytime it got a close up to their shirts, it switched. Like we're not actually able to see like the messages on their show. But me being a Black person, like obviously I'm paying attention to that because that hits me deeply. Like Breonna Taylor, that definitely hit me deeply, you know? Me being a Black woman, the type of macroaggressions I've dealt with on this campus from faculty, from students, seeing like the fact that you can't even like acknowledge the life that was lost without them skipping to the next side. If anything, that is what's bothering me, you know? So I feel like if more people were to pay attention to that, call that out, there will be more of a change.
Thank you, Professor Schaffer. Thank you, Skye. I don't see any other hands or comments in the chat right now. Okay, Willa has a comment. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I was just wondering, Skye, like, especially because you talked about Hobart a lot and like in the context of our school, you know, something that I've noticed since being at this school is like I hear it from conservative people a lot that like the school is so liberal, but compared to a lot of like liberal arts schools and schools in our position, we have the, I guess you could say, opportunity to interact with a lot of different conservative students. Do you feel like the colleges like HWS is a good, it's kind of like a microcosm of the bigger US, and like some of the stuff we experience here and some of the ways in which we promoted diversity here could be applied on like a more national level? Or I don't know, like just do you feel anything like that?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you brought up that word too, diversity. I have a big problem with the school's website because like this whole diversity and inclusion message that they keep trying to like bring up, I honestly feel like it's like the biggest like sense of tokenism this school could possibly show. You said you were junior, right? Like were you around when that football player came for what you might call it, the Young Americans for Freedom?
I'm a senior, but I remember, yes.
Yeah, that was an interesting day. And the way the school handled the way that moderator was acting towards that Black student, honestly, yeah, it's definitely a microcosm, or however you said it, of the United States. Like a lot of the things that happens within Hobart, William Smith, like Black students are told to just like deal with it. Black students are told to not be so aggressive about it. Asian students, they're basically invisible. Like, if we're going to talk about Asian students, we're going to have to go to some of their events and stuff and see what they're doing, because, you know, nobody really cares about them. Nobody cares about the Black students unless they're having parties, unless they're in sports teams, so on and so forth. It's the same thing that happens in the United States. People don't like Black people unless they're playing basketball or some other type of sport, unless they're doing something that seems to fit their norm. Same thing happens here. But we have this whole thing about diversity. We don't even have a diverse faculty. And I was actually having a conversation with Miss Ivashkova about that earlier, about the fact that a lot of the times, if you look at some of I can't think of the word right now, and I don't feel like it. But if you look at the website and see like the list of the people that are in charge of the departments, I'll say out of the 50 people I saw up there was like 4 professors of color. But we talk about diversity and inclusion. Like I said, it's like a normalcy of prejudice. Like, whiteness is the norm here. And that's why people think, you know, everything is so fine and dandy because this is normal to them. What we see here at HWS is normal, but it shouldn't be. And that's the point of my project.
Maddie, you now can unmute yourself.
Thank you. I just wanted to make a comment to go off of what Skye was saying in terms of diversity. But in the beginning of this summer, I don't know if my audio is okay, if everyone can hear, but in the beginning of the summer, like probably around the end of June-ish, when the school was getting called out for their lack of participation in the Black Lives Matter movement, I noticed on their school's website that on the home page, there was nothing about Black Lives Matter, but when you went onto the Africana Studies department, there was a big banner at the top that said Black Lives Matter.
It said, ask me about Black Lives Matter.
Yeah, that's what it said. Ask me about Black Lives Matter. So I feel like that shows a lot about how the school prioritizes what they see and deem as diversity. But yeah.
Thank you for that, Matt.
Mm-hmm. So, okay, so I think we should move on in the interest of time, and then we can come back to those conversations at the end. So Willa, why don't you go ahead now and share your screen?
Okay, awesome. I'm just gonna set up my timer. Okay, wait. Ooh, okay. I'm gonna share my screen. Great. Okay. So, hi, I'm Willa Dow. I'm a senior at the colleges. I'm majoring in French and International Relations. And this summer, I was very, very lucky to be able to do this presentation and to do this research. So I titled my research, Conceptualizing Linkages Between Colonialism and Climate Change in Africa. I'm just gonna read you the intro to my paper, and then I'll kind of explain how I'm gonna do the rest of the presentation. So since the Industrial Revolution, humans have been adding carbon to our planet's atmosphere and gradually changing our climate. However, this addition of carbon has not been something all countries have contributed to equally. For decades, the largest, most industrialized economies have been the greatest emitters. Today, we see the United States and China at the top of these lists. Beyond the simple emission of carbon, the world has seen rampant extraction of natural resources and destruction of wildlife and ecosystems. New weather patterns and extreme weather events increasingly threaten populations all over the globe, but those most at risk are women, children, and the developing world. In this essay, in the presentation, we will turn towards Africa, one of the most resource-rich continents on this planet. Despite this incredible diversity, one commonality throughout the continent is the history and the legacy of colonialism. It is no secret that the colonial exploits in Africa are responsible for much of the underdevelopment we see there today. But how have those colonial exploits and their neo-colonial legacies impacted how Africans are experiencing and will experience climate change? So I came across this topic in reading Christopher Parenti's book, The Tropic of Chaos, in my political science seminar last spring. And I'll talk a little bit more about that book later, but it kind of brought me to this question of like, how is the developing world impacted by the history that they have, the history that they've experienced, and how is that relating to how they're going to experience climate change, one of the biggest disasters and crises we're ever going to see in our lifetime. So I kind of asked myself, the way I'm going to structure this research is I'm going to start by talking about the research design, and then I'm going to go into the colonial histories that of each country in my what's it called, like in my research design, and then I'll kind of go to the conclusion. So, oops, there we go. So this picture that you can see right here is a map of the world, and it maps out the ITCZ zone, which stands for the Intertropical Convergence Zone. It's just a weather pattern. If you've ever heard of like trade winds, it's basically the trade winds, and it brings about somewhat predictable weather patterns, especially in regards to precipitation throughout the years. And I came across this in reading the Parenti book that I was talking about, Tropic of Chaos, where he talks about how the regions of the world where this ITCZ zone flows through are going to be those that are most at risk for climate change in the future. This is because they're the ones who are, one, mostly on the equator, right? But then they're also developing countries and countries that are facing a lot of violence. So he talks about what's called a catastrophic convergence, and it's a catastrophic convergence of poverty, violence, and climate change. So that's just something to like store in the back of your head for later. But the way I chose my countries was I chose countries that were within this zone, and I wanted to look at Africa specifically. And I chose countries that were all had the same colonial ruler, just because it kind of helped to even things out and make it a little more simple. Because there's a lot of different variants, between who colonized what, and that's just a lot more variables than I need. So I chose countries that were all colonized by France. One, because I have language background in France, but also because France employed different colonial projects, and they did a lot of direct rule, which definitely influenced the way these countries then developed in independence. But even further than that, France also employs what's called French colonial debt programs, the CFA franc. It basically is similar to a structural adjustment program, and I'll talk about that later again. But the countries that I chose were Niger, Cote d'Ivoire, Central African Republic, and the Republic of the Congo. I'm going to give you a quick rundown on each one of those and their colonial histories. So first is the Republic of the Congo. It was colonized officially by France in 1901. There were disputes between who had control over the territory between France and Belgium at the time. So after resolving those competing claims with Belgium, the colonization of this land began, and it really focused, just like a lot of places in that region, on ivory and rubber extraction using forced labor of indigenous populations. Then what we saw, because it became kind of less so viable financially for France, is that they allowed foreign investors to come in and invest in the continent. As you can imagine, the legacies of this kind of colonization are horrific, because people are coming in only to invest and only to get back money on like a very specific investment, with no real propensity or desire to create actual infrastructure. Despite divesting state funds, there still was some infrastructure built, but the main infrastructure that was built was a railway, basically just to take resources out of the continent to the coast so it could be traded and sold. Today, the Republic of the Congo has a really high external debt rate of about 120%, which is definitely not ideal, and their government depends heavily on the oil resources that they have in the country and off the coastline. It's tough to talk about because it's kind of like a similar situation to what you might see in Venezuela or other like rentier states, but I'll get to that later. And then we're going to move on to our next country, which is Niger, or Niger, you can say it either way. I was officially colonized in 1990. I mean, why does it say 1990? That should say 1890. I was officially colonized in 1890 by France, and this is a really great example of how a lot of French colonies were acquired and the mindset under which they were acquired. It was acquired as a land holding. So it was basically just to it was out of competition with England. As we know, France and England have been competitors for millennia, like literally forever. But it's a really clear example of how Africa during the colonial era was used as a setting for a proxy struggle that was taking place on a completely different continent. And it eventually led to the division of Niger and Nigeria. So that was originally kind of one competed landholding, and then it was divided, obviously not by a border that would make sense, but just to split up the continents, the countries evenly between France and England. Today, Niger is consistently pretty low on the development index. They struggle with different, mostly poverty and violent conflicts as well. But the thing that is most interesting to me is France is Niger's #1 trading partner for both imports and exports. And I also forgot to mention for the Congo, France is also one of the biggest trading partners for imports. And next we are going to move on to the Central African Republic. So the Central African Republic is like right smack dab in the middle of Africa. It is another landholding that was created mostly just to have strategic advantage in the region. France wanted to have easier access to the Nile River when there was, disputes between England and France over who had control over that. And it was initially, it's very frustrating for me to talk about this because it just is somewhere that was like taken and stolen just so that they could more easily access a river that was never theirs in the first place. Then also after independence, and this is something that's just important in general for Central African Republic, is they found a lot of diamond resources, and they then allowed private investors. Private investors were already allowed in Central African Republic, just like they were in the Democratic Republic of the Congo, or the Republic of the Congo, sorry. And they allowed foreign investors there. And I just want to take a second to make a point that the trend of allowing foreign investors into a country is something that continues even today, but allowing foreign investors to come in with no regard for the sanctity of the people that are there and the people that are living there, again, is a trend that continues. And the authoritarian regimes and the regimes that have been established there are trends of essentially what was happening in colonialism, because it's just what happens when you create a society or you create a government or a state that has no other purpose other than to make as much profit as possible for the state without actually paying any mind or caring at all to the well-being or the lives of the people that are living there. And so the Central African Republic is a great example of what happens here. I believe it's kind of similar to what we see in Niger and the Republic of the Congo, and the legacies of exploitation by an elite did not change in the post-colonial era. It just simply happened to change faces. But all of the infrastructures were there for that exploitation to continue. And then our last is going to be Cote d'Ivoire. This is just a really interesting country in general to look at. Cote d'Ivoire was officially colonized by France in 1890. It is the largest, it still today is the largest export of cocoa in the world, and it definitely had a lot of agricultural properties in that day. But at the time, it again was seen as a strategic land holding mostly, and it obviously was used, as the name might suggest, to get a lot of resources through the ivory trade, because it was a really ivory-rich place. The elephants there were hunted almost to extinction. But it was seen as strategic landholding to protect the Gold Coast, and then also as kind of a ladder into Sudan. Cote d'Ivoire is the only country out of all of my 4 countries and case studies whose top import or export partner is not France. And it's also the only one of those countries that whose primary export is not a non-renewable natural resource. Because so Central African Republic exports diamonds, Republic of the Congo exports oil, and Niger's primary export is uranium. So it's the only one whose non-renewable resource doesn't primarily export a non-renewable resource. And that brings me to talking about the CFA franc. So the CFA franc is a monetary policy that was set up by the French after decolonization so that newly independent colonies could pay France back for the infrastructure they allegedly built. If African countries didn't agree to these policies in the post-colonial era, France threatened to literally like physically destroy all of the infrastructure. This monetary policy is multifaceted, and it allows France to this day, like today, right now, to maintain an immense amount of power and control over these former colonies. So these African countries have had to pay a colonial debt each year while also having their federal reserves held and controlled by France. Additionally, these countries can only access 15% of their reserves at a time. If they wish to access more money, they have to take out loans, like at commercial rates. France has exclusive rights to supply military training and equipment and to deploy troops there if needed. They can deploy troops at I think any time to any of these countries. And French companies, and this is the point that I was getting to with the trade, have right of first refusal to any natural resources that are found in these countries. It's undeniable that these policies have greatly affected the way African countries have developed, just like other structural adjustment policies, which are not really helpful or effective. And what I found really interesting is that because of this right of refusal and prioritization France gets, the natural resources it takes from Africa, they get at a much lower rate because they're the first ones offering a contract. And it kind of ties into climate change for me because they're buying oil and other non-renewable energy resources from these countries at incredibly low rates and then taking them and using them and polluting the world and then making climate change worse for these countries, and these countries are going to be more affected. So that kind of brings me back in. So this is just the last sentence of my conclusion or my intro, which I already read to you, but how will it continue to affect how Africans are experiencing and will experience climate change? So in 2016, China contributed the most to our greenhouse gases, followed closely by the US and all of the EU combined. Those are the top three emitters. And so all the EU combined contributed the third most, and Africa contributed as an entire continent less than 1% of all of the emissions we saw in 2016. Not incredibly surprising, the US and China are more industrialized countries with bigger populations who use a lot of energy, but they also use more energy than they need to and are not unaware of the effects that that has on climate change. So if large industrialized nations pollute the most, are they going to experience climate change the harshest? Likely no. So countries lower on the development index are more susceptible to the effects of climate change simply because they're poorer, there's more violence, and there's less stability overall in lives. And it creates a lot of disadvantaged situations for if there's a flood, if there's a drought, if there's a food shortage. And so with less established governments and more overall instability, food and resource insecurity, it's not surprising that the greatest crisis in our history is going to affect these people disproportionately. As climate change continues, countries will become uninhabitable, and as is expected, we're going to see one of the largest global climate migrations in our history. And if we look back to what happened in Syria and when we had millions of Syrian refugees, it doesn't make me feel very hopeful considering the way international governments responded to a huge migration crisis. But whose responsibility is it really? Considering what we know about underdeveloped countries being more susceptible to climate change, it seems only fair that we adopt a polluter pays policy. However, I think the responsibility is far, far greater than just mitigating climate change coming from the polluters now. Africa was colonized by Europe in a way that gave enormous wealth to the West and left negative impacts on Africa. The continued exploitation of Africa today and throughout the colonial period by the West, especially by France, continues to impede the development of other countries on the continent. Monetary policies like structural adjustment programs and the CFA franc are gross examples of neocolonialism today, but are rarely seen as such in the international community. The West has continually underdeveloped Africa, which has made the continent more susceptible to the climate change that we're seeing now. In addition to the impacts of colonial exploits and neocolonial projects, industrialized countries who, for the most part, are not going to feel the effects of climate change the same way as the developing world, are the ones who have contributed to it the most. The onus to find a solution for climate change has always been on the West. They have contributed the most to the greatest crisis in our history and are the only ones who can stop our changing climate as they are polluting. But the way we are going to see climate change play out will require a far deeper understanding of our history and responsibility for actions of the past. So there's no real way to know how Africa or South America or the Middle East or Asia would have developed without climate change and without these encroachments. But what we do know is that the way many places around the world have failed to develop or are struggling incredibly right now have a direct link to interventions by the West. So basically, in summary, and the point that I kind of want everyone to take away, and it brings it back to the catastrophic convergence theory, is that the countries who've contributed the most to our changing climate are also those who are responsible for underdeveloping Africa, for the most part. Some exceptions there. If we go back to the catastrophic convergence theory of poverty, climate, and violence, we can see who has caused these things. We can see who has caused climate change. Can see who has contributed to poverty in the region, and we can see who has exacerbated violence by creating erroneous borders, by creating poverty, by intervening when they shouldn't be in certain continents to promote political ideals. So in my opinion, the only way to solve the issues in the global South and the ones that they're going to face in the impending climate crisis will be from understanding these issues and where they truly stem from in a really, really complete way, because I think that's the only way we can properly mitigate the problems we're going to see in the future. That's all I have. Do you have any questions?
Excellent. Thanks so much, Willa. I'm sure we'll have questions. Let me see the chat. So, if you have a question, either raise your hand. Willa, can you stop sharing your screen so we can see each other a little bit better? So you can either raise your hand, I will unmute you, or you can put your name into the chat and I'll call on you. Professor Robertson, I'm going to unmute you.
Oh, thanks, you're still muted.
You're still muted. You have to accept my unmute, I think.
That should do it.
Mm-hmm.
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Willa, thank you so much for that comprehensive and comprehensible analysis. Thinking about the potential here, I wonder if you explored the relationship between the petroleum extract industries and the instability in the governments in the countries you studied. In other words, the enormous amount of money that goes to countries, well, to their titular rulers, for the licenses to exploit their oil doesn't get distributed to the people in those countries. And those corporations making those contracts are aware of it. Is there some kind of global response to the way that the oil extraction industries work that would put this more into a foreign policy context?
Yeah.
You know, an awareness that destabilizing and failing to distribute the wealth constitutes a destabilization of the entire continent, as well as puts them at threat for climate change.
No,
I don't know if you explored that.
Yeah, so I wanted to look into more stuff like that. I had my head was the scope of what I wanted to think about was so big. But that is something I really hope to look forward to in the future, because this is, I feel like, a project I could keep studying for the rest of my life. And that's something I really wanted to look into. And so I didn't necessarily look into it really, really intently, but from what I've learned just in my research here, and then I'm also taking an African politics class at the moment, is that those those contracts and that kind of like, it all has to do with the way the government is structured. And a lot of those structures are legacies of colonialism. And so being able to change that means like making actual like marketable change in governmental structures, but also allowing for more democracy and actually supporting and upholding like real democracies and not necessarily ones that are a little more like not legitimate per se. But it's definitely, thank you. That gives me something really cool to look into in the future.
Well, I want you to know I'm not criticizing you. I just thought you would have some insights, and indeed you do, that the current government structures are holdovers from government structures that benefited the colonizer. So thank you for that insight.
Thank you. It's a good question.
Okay. Let's see. While people are thinking, I have a comment, not really a question, but I find sort of the catastrophic convergence theory really striking. And I feel like we are in the middle of experiencing something like this here in the United States, surprisingly, right? We're seeing sort of several crises overlapping. Fires in California. So we have global climate change affecting some regions. We have the COVID disaster, and then we have poverty and violence, and general inequality and economic instability, right? So we're seeing all those crises converging, and we see just how catastrophic that can become very quickly.
Yeah.
So we have Professor Murphy. Go ahead, you can unmute yourself now.
Yeah, thanks to both of you. Just a comment for Skye, and kind of a half-baked question for you, Willa. So Skye, I just was so struck that you were on a college campus for 2 presidential elections. That's just such an extraordinary advantage to have. I'd actually be interested to hear you maybe talk a little bit more about what the approaching election means for you. Is there activism beyond just this presentation for you? Just knowing what you know based on the last election. And Willa, I guess the thing that struck me about your presentation was your discussion of developing countries and just that, I guess that binary between like the developed world and the developing world. And I wonder if that is like a trap, like the trap of development, because that's always going to require extractivism. There's this really famous scholar named Claire Colebrook who says that developed spaces are going to be less adaptable to climate change. In other words, the countries that can pivot are going to be the ones that haven't basically fallen into the trap of development, aren't locked into a particular form of progress. And I guess the question is, like, is there an upside to maybe leaning into climate change and just letting countries like the United States get hurt into like having to dismantle the structure rather than thinking with development and this thing that's a potential trap, like maybe think with like anti-development? Is that something you've thought about, or am I just being loopy? What do you think?
Well, actually, that's something I think about like all the time because I mean, I remember like, what was it, 5 or 6 years ago when I was in high school and I was in Model UN, and I was in like a environmental class or an environmental conference for Model UN. And it made me really think like because I remember we were talking about how to sustainably develop, and we were like, oh, should there be emissions caps put on, developing, quote unquote, developing countries? And all it made me think about was like, well, like all of these countries, if they're just, living their own life, like why can't they just develop in a way that's sustainable and develop using new modes and stuff? And I remember actually we read this really cool book, to bring it back to my seminar class last spring, called The Drawdown, I think, by Paul Hawken. And it like lays out a bunch of different ways that we can combat climate change. If you ever want to feel like a little better about climate change, you can read it because it shows a bunch of solutions. And a big one of those is indigenous practices and, playing into the stuff and the knowledge that people already know. And I don't think that development is the answer. And I kind of like, there's not a lot of other ways to talk about developing countries or versus developed countries other than using those two words. It's difficult to like explain it, but I also don't think that necessarily, I think there's like definitely going to be a really huge change in the way our whole world is. And I think it's a great point to point out that like, we're going to have to, countries that are continuing to develop right now, like should be allowed to develop, but need to be funded to develop in a sustainable way, that they can still have the same advantage that, we had in the Industrial Revolution, but in nowadays terms in a way that we know is going to be sustainable for our future.
Thank you, Willa. Thank you, Professor Murphy. We have another question from Professor Dunn, who is an Africanist. I'm going to read it out loud. So Willa, your discussion focuses a great deal on the impact of France and French policies on Francophone Africa. I was wondering if you could readjust the focus a bit to talk about African agency. Specifically, I'm curious to hear your thoughts about the extent to which Francophone African states have pushed climate change issues on the global stage, and the extent to which they've been successful in shaping the discussion around climate change and responsibility.
Yeah, so, I mean, this question is definitely really important because as we've realized, I mean, if we even just look at, Africa's response to COVID, which has been like absolutely amazing, Africa is a place that we can look to for a lot of solutions. It's not a continent that's like needing to be saved or that's without its own agency and ability. And I can't necessarily speak to specific things because I honestly have not been paying as much attention as I usually do to like international climate policy. But I think it's important to recognize that, like, especially when it comes to real lived experiences of African people. I mean, there were huge floods in Senegal, and then also, I can't remember what country it is, but another country like nearby in the region, just in the last month. And so they're experiencing climate change like right now. Like right now, those experiences are happening. And I think being able to like listen to those people and take the policies that African leaders and that African citizens are asking for and implementing them like on an international stage is going to be something that's really, really important, because after all, like, they know more about their experience than maybe, the United States or other actors that are existing within that sphere do.
Thanks, Willa. That was an excellent answer, I think. I think Professor Murphy had also a question for Skye, but she didn't have a chance to respond. Skye, do you remember the question?
I do. I was actually sending him a private message to answer it, but I guess I can answer it to everybody. I think he asked about whether or not, can you actually repeat your question? I heard something about advantages, what I'm doing after this project. Like, if you could like reiterate your question.
Yeah, I was just saying how struck I was. It's just such a precious thing to be able to experience a presidential election on a college campus. And when I say precious, I don't mean to like undermine like the genuine fear that people have in elections. It's just to be around young people on a college campus and to be able to have that twice. It's just so unique. And just having gone through that really, I think, formational experience once, I wondered if you could say a little bit more about the approaching election, what that means for you beyond this project. Is there something that you learned from the first time around that is going to inform like your citizenship the second time around?
Well, after the first election, like I said earlier, I was just kind of disappointed with the way people were reacting to the elections, some of the microaggressions, blatant macroaggression towards the Hispanic students or whatnot. And with this upcoming election and with the way the media, the way the president has been vilifying China, saying that they're the reason for this virus, and the Black Lives Matter protest that's been happening throughout the entire country, this upcoming election does mean a lot to me, considering that I went to a protest in Rochester for Daniel Crude, because I've been tear gas, shot at with pepper bullets. Like, I know what it's like to be a Black person in America, and most certainly I know what it means to be a Black woman in America. So with this upcoming election, I just want to like pay attention to how the student body reacts to it, mostly, like, because yeah, there's the faculty, but like, we mostly deal with the students, we mostly deal with each other. And like I said, a lot of things happen behind closed doors. Nobody say anything about some of the tension that exists within students on campus. I wanted to, I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I mentioned it to you in the private message. I turned this project into an independent study because I wanted to continue to talk about some of the systemic oppression that exists here on campus and exists here in Geneva and the United States as a whole. So this election, I'm just waiting to see what happens afterwards.
Okay. I don't see any other questions or comments. And we are at 8:01. So I'm going to thank the presenters. They did a marvelous job, and so important. It's such important conversations to have on campus. So kudos to you all. And the third presenter, Mercy Sherman, is also dealing with the issues of racial justice, but she'll present in February. So thank you so much for all of you who came. And I'm sure it means a lot to the students, right?
Yeah, thank you guys for coming. It means a lot.
Thank you for listening to me stuttering.
So have a lovely evening.
Bye. Thank you again.